We are quickly approaching a transition period in the Pokemon TCG. Rotation is coming soon, and we are going to be saying goodbye to roughly a year's worth of cards. So today, I wanted to give flowers to all of the cards that we're losing to the 2025 rotation that have had any sort of meta relevancy. I'm Jet from inthirdperson.com. Make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and let's talk about the cards going away in the 2025 rotation. But we're going to start things off with a quick primer on rotation. If you're not familiar with what rotation is, I'm going to do a very quick run through of what that is. And if you are experienced with the Pokemon TCG, you know what rotation is, jump to the timestamp right here, and we're going to get to all of the good cards that are going away. In order to know what rotation is, you need to know what standard format is. Now, the Pokemon TCG is played in what is called standard format. It is a game mode where we are only really using the last 2 to 3 years worth of cards. No one's playing with a base set Charizard in 2024/2025. It's just like the last 2 to 3 years worth of cards. And at the time of this recording, before the 2025 rotation, cards that are legal in standard format right now are anything with the letters F, G, and H as their tournament marking in the bottom left-hand corner. So you can see on this Regidrago V-Star card, there's a letter F at the bottom left-hand corner. And that's going to serve as a quick guide to understand which cards are legal and which cards are going away. Rotation is a process that occurs once a year, and during that time, the oldest set of cards that are legal are moved out of the standard format. And there's a number of reasons why this happens. One, it helps balance the game, because having to balance 2 to 3 years worth of cards is a lot easier than balancing 25 plus years worth of cards. It also helps the game explore new ideas. You can have Pokemon that have 280 HP and drop multiple prizes when you're not worrying about base set Charizard that has like 120 HP. So being able to move the game forward is something that is more possible when you're not worrying about locking yourself into rules from decades ago. And then just from a logistics standpoint, Pokemon can't print all of these cards that they were making in 1998 in 2024, right? They have new sets that they're printing all the time for collectors and players, and so the standard format is generally what are the cards that Pokemon is actively printing and keeping in stock in stores. But that being said, if you have these older cards that you love that you still want to play, you can still use them in expanded format, which works from Black and White onward. In this upcoming 2025 rotation, we are losing all F block cards. This includes cards from Brilliant Stars, Astral Radiance, Pokemon Go, Lost Origin, Silver Tempest, and Crown Zenith. This is a very big rotation because we're losing a lot of playable cards in this cycle. We're also saying goodbye to the Sword and Shield era in standard format. All the remaining Pokemon V, V-Star, V-Max are going away as part of this rotation. We're saying goodbye to all Radiant Pokemon. We're also saying goodbye to the last of the yellow bordered cards. Those are all going away as well. If you've got more questions about rotation and how it works, check out the FAQ video I made, link in the description below. This rotation is going to be happening in 2 different waves. The first wave is in Pokemon TCG Live. It'll occur on Thursday, March 27th, 2025. And then for in-person play, it will happen on Friday, April 11th, 2025. We're going to cover things in order of release, and the F block starts with Brilliant Stars. Yes, Charizard is one of the featured Pokemon in this set. Charizard V-Star ended up not really doing much of anything, but the real star of Brilliant Stars was Arceus. This is a card that put in work with over 80 appearances in regional championship top 8s, including 12 wins, and then 40 international top 8 appearances, including 6 wins. And then its biggest win was the World Championships in 2022 when Andre Scubal won the whole thing with Arceus Flying Pikachu. This was a fantastic card for its time because it had a really solid attack, Trinity Nova doing 200 damage, and you got to accelerate 3 basic energy cards to your Pokemon V on the bench in any way you like. And Starbirth is such a good ability, letting you grab 2 cards from your deck that you needed, and oftentimes you would pop this as soon as you got Arceus V-Star to help you set up. And I cannot understate like how good this card was. It was never like super broken OP, but it was always solid, and it became the backbone of so many different Pokemon V, where a lot of Pokemon V at the time were just not that playable because they didn't have any good ways of accelerating energy, and Arceus V-Star just became an amazing partner for so many different Pokemon, and we saw so many different builds. And I know I've only highlighted 2 different builds here, including Arceus Pikachu, and then Arceus Duraludon was another big partner for Arceus, but pretty much any Pokemon V got better when paired with Arceus V-Star. And this was a card that was a tournament staple for a number of years, and it only really lost steam in 2024 when it finally got power crept out of the game. But Arceus V-Star, wonderful card that saved Pokemon TCG in a way, just making the game a lot more exciting, breathing new life into a lot of Pokemon V, V-Stars, and V-Maxes, and just really fun to play without ever being too OP. Salute, Arceus V-Star. Bibarel was an amazing addition to the game. Before this, it was pretty much just Genesect V being able to draw a billion cards, and then Bibarel was a way that pretty much any other deck could also draw a number of cards. Industrious Incisors let you draw up to 5, and you could have multiple Bibarels on your bench to help draw even more cards. Bibarel had a wonderful career with a number of first place finishes, including first place at the World Championships paired with Arceus and Flying Pikachu, but it was also a staple in Chien-Pao decks. We saw it in Charizard for a while, Goldengo saw Bibarel play for a little bit, and just a number of different deck archetypes love drawing cards with Bibarel. We don't see Bibarel as much these days, but it's still a great card that has had an amazing career. There was a brief moment in time when Bench Barrier Mew had rotated out and Manaphy hadn't arrived yet, and bench sniping went absolutely crazy, especially Rapid Strike Urshifu, which was just bombing the bench for months at a time. And then Manaphy showed up and brought balance to the world. Its wave availability protected the bench from damage and really put a lot of these bench sniping decks in check, which made it pretty much a mandatory card in many different decks. Now, you could just take out the Manaphy by gusting it into the active, and we also saw Canceling Cologne come up not long after, and eventually this card kind of got power crept out of the game. In recent months, cards like Dusknoir can just blow up and take out Manaphy, and Dragapult can snipe the Manaphy with damage counters instead of damage, but for bench protection, Manaphy was a staple in many decks for years, and even now, with Rabsca in the mix as a potential alternative to Manaphy, people are still playing Manaphy when they want to protect the bench because it's a basic and you can put it down right away, versus Rabsca, which you have to evolve into. Some of Manaphy's big highlights include a second place finish at the 2023 World Championships in Tord's Gardevoir deck, got top 4 in 2022 in James Cox's Palkia deck, and then first at the Indonesia Championships with a Lost Box deck. But again, these are just a couple of highlights. This card was everywhere and has a ton of top finishes to its name. Lumineon is a fantastic support Pokemon where you put it down on your bench, grab a supporter card of your choice. Now, when it first came out, it didn't see as much play. I think Crobat V was still kind of in the format and people were using that to draw up cards, although that's more like a Squawkabilly-ish card. But Lumineon V ended up becoming a lot better over time as people found different combos to work with it. Even in its early days when it wasn't being played as much, still ended up being in the World Championship deck in 2022 and the second place deck in 2023. But I think this card really came into its own when Charizard found the Arvenzard combo with Arven and Forest Seal Stone, and you could grab that Arven with Lumineon, grab Forest Seal Stone, and just consistently set up Charizard. And I think this is going to be one of the biggest losses to arguably the most popular deck in the game. And there's going to be a lot of question marks about how do certain decks go on without Lumineon V? Not to give anyone false hope, but before Lumineon V, we had Tapu Lele GX, which was the exact same ability. That went away for a little bit. Lumineon V came in with the exact same ability. I would not be surprised to see this ability come back in some capacity down the road. I'm not guaranteeing anything, but based on past precedent, Pokemon does like this ability in the game, and maybe we'll see this in the near future. Raikou V was a deck that didn't have a home for most of its first year in existence, but when Lugia started to pop off and Lost Zone was in the mix, Lost Zone adopted Raikou V as their go-to way of one-shotting Lugia V-Star, where Raikou had a home in Lost Box for quite some time and then eventually found its home in Miraidon decks, peaking at third in the World Championships in 2024. But we also saw this in Vikavolt decks, where it won San Diego Regionals thanks to Gibson Archer Tang, and that was pretty wild at the time, seeing like an item lock deck win, and I guess that kind of foreshadowing where the game could be going very soon, as there's a lot of buzz in Japan about Badu, which is an item locking card that every deck in Japan is supposedly playing right now. And yeah, before that, we saw an item lock deck win, and Raikou V was in there. And then even in Lugia itself, it was a Lugia counter card. Rahul Reddy has been playing Raikou V in their Lugia deck for some time, and it's been working very well for them, including 9th at the World Championships this past year. Raichu V is a very powerful but very expensive card in terms of building it up. Its dynamic spark attack can one-hit KO anything in the game, but you need a ton of energy on the board in order to use it in a meaningful fashion. And it wasn't until Miraidon showed up where it finally found its home and got acceleration from Electric Generator and Flaffy, and most recently Magneton out of Surging Sparks. And even before Magneton and Surging Sparks, Raichu was in and out of the deck where it just was a little too clunky when there wasn't enough energy acceleration to make it work. But in the current format with Magneton in play, I think Raichu is going to be a staple in Miraidon decks until it rotates out. And even when it was in and out here and there, it's had quite the run, including first place finishes in Sacramento, at LAIC, and at Toronto Regionals. Of the 3 legendary beasts, Entei has had the worst run. Suicune V was a very strong deck in its own right until V-Star Pokemon showed up. Raikou V had a really good run in multiple decks. Entei V didn't really find its footing until Iron Valiant showed up, at which point it became a very cool and fun aggressive deck with some cool damage counter options, with Iron Valiant dancing in and out of the active, and it even almost won it actually did win a major championship, LAIC 2023-2024, in the juniors division, and second place at LAIC in the masters division as well. Its run was relatively short-lived. There was only a couple weeks or months where Entei V as its own deck did well, but it does kind of have a home in Gouging Fire, which at this point is also very much on the niche end of the play spectrum. But Entei V is still a solid card with a really strong attack, especially in the current format with Area Zero Underdepths expanding the benches so Entei V could swing for even more. It will probably still end as like the worst of the 3 legendary beasts, but I'm glad that it finally got some shine towards the end of its life. Whimsicott V-Star is long forgotten, but there was a stretch of a couple of months when this first came out when it was a terror. Its Trick Wind attack did 160 damage, and during your opponent's next turn, they can't play any Pokemon tool or special energy cards from their hand. This was shutting off things like Arceus V-Star and that double turbo energy attachment, and Rapid Strike Urshifu VMAX with its Rapid Strike energy. And for a couple of weeks there, it was a nightmare, including a top 8 finish at a regionals and 3 international top 8 appearances as well. Even a win, first place at Special Event Bilbao by Alessandro Cremascoli. Oh man, I'm gonna get the pronunciation wrong. I remember Frank Persick getting second place at EUIC, and this deck came out of nowhere and was such a cool meta call and probably the highlight for this deck. But unfortunately, the meta, I think once Astral Radiance came out and Palkia took over the game, Trick Wind just wasn't the attack that was good for the meta going forward, and Whimsicott V-Star just kind of disappeared. But I'll never forget the crazy run that it had from Brilliant Stars up to Astral Radiance. Aggron VMAX was a card nobody played, and then Adam Hawkins surprised the world with a top 16 finish at Worlds with an Arceus Aggron deck. And this is a card that did a ton of damage. 270 damage for 5 energy was a lot, but it was also on a 330 HP Juggernaut. Really big Pokemon, and with Arceus, you could cover that cost somewhat reasonably on Aggron, and some decks just weren't equipped for it. Now, it never became a popular tech, but it was always played with Arceus, and there are players that did see some success with Arceus Aggron. Charizard V-Star is a card that I liked, and I made a bunch of videos trying to make this card work. And despite being one of the cover feature Pokemon in Brilliant Stars, it never really found its footing in tournament play, peaking at 24th in the special event Milan and an Arceus Charizard build. But its attack was kind of cool, 130 damage, and if you had damage counters on it, you did 100 more damage. 230 is a good number, and you could get the damage on Charizard with Magma Basin, and then its Starblaze attack was awesome for 3 fire and a colorless energy, just doing 320 damage, and you discard 2 energy. But that was enough to one-hit KO like V maxes at the time, and up trading to take 3 prizes with this attack was awesome. But it just got worse over time, and even at the time when there were still a lot of V maxes, Charizard V-Star wasn't really good enough to hang. Zamazenta V is a card that hasn't seen a lot of play, but I didn't realize until doing research for this video that it actually has a first place finish under its belt. At Secaucus Regionals, Luke Smith won it with an Arceus box deck, and it has a cool ability where you get to discard your hand and draw 5 cards to end your turn, and this could be a way of finding the pieces you need to set up your Arceus, but then its Revenge Blast attack was not that bad either. For 1 metal and 2 colorless, did 120 damage plus 30 more damage for each prize card your opponent has taken. This could be a strong end game attacker as well, which Luke Smith's deck was built for because it had energy, metal energy as well to power up the Zamazenta V. And then we also saw it get 15th at Brisbane Regionals in 2022 and 23rd at Santiago Regionals in 2022. More recently, a couple of Cerulege decks and maybe even some Archaludon decks have been running Zamazenta V, and it's probably still going to be a niche card until it rotates. Moltres V was neat. It did 20 damage, but also 70 more damage if you got some damage on there. This comboed really nicely with Magma Basin, and you could get a nice turn 1 going second attack with this Moltres, taking out some smaller Pokemon. It never really saw much play until Entei Iron Valiant came along, at which point it was starting to get some top 16 finishes. But with Entei and Iron Valiant kind of falling off the face of the earth, we don't really see this card anymore, but it was cool for the time. Minccino was a card that did see play before Lugia V-Star. I vaguely remember this being in Malamar decks for a little bit, but really it's known for being in Lugia V-Star, where you could evolve this up to Cinccino, at which point Cinccino can do 1 billion damage with a whole bunch of special energy attached to it. Some highlights include first at the Japan Championships this past year, first at Joinville Regionals this year, and then back in 2022 in an Arceus deck of all things, it got first with a Arceus deck, and I think this was evolving up to the Cinccino that had the Gardevoir ability where you discard a card and draw 2 cards. Despite how old this card is, it's only really seeing play now. Thanks to Curse Blast, Dusclops, and Dusknoir, this version of Duskull will be going away as part of rotation, but it is seeing some play right now as the go-to Duskull for a number of different decks. Now, there are other Duskulls that you can play right now. Competitive players lean towards this one because there is a chance that maybe you have Psychic Energy in your deck, or maybe you can make your opponent think you have Psychic Energy in your deck, at which point you could do 10 damage and confuse your Pokemon. So if you are playing a Psychic deck, you probably want this version of Duskull. If you're not, you might still want this version of Duskull to threaten this attack. Though, yeah, losing this Duskull, it kind of stinks, but it's not the end of the world because the actual benefit of this card is pretty minimal. One of the cool things about Arceus is that it had access to Sharon's Care, where you got to put one of your colorless Pokemon that has any damage counters on it and all attached cards into your hand. Arceus was never the heaviest hitter, but you could tank a hit and then Sharon's Care that damaged Arceus out of play and then bring in a fresh one, and you could Sharon's Care loop over and over again to try and keep Arceus alive. And you were never the most offensive deck, but you would try and win on the War of Attrition. And other colorless cards did use Sharon's Care as well, including Zoroark V-Star. A couple of big wins here, including first at NEIC 2022 with Azul GG winning with Arceus Flying Pikachu. Also got a win with Zoroark V-Star and Arceus Giratina. Collapse Stadium saw a lot of play in its time. It forces both players to have benches that are only 4 wide instead of 5, and in certain cases you would use this to force your opponent to have less room to work with. In other cases, you could use this to bump support Pokemon off of your board that you don't need in play anymore, like a Rotom or a Lumineon. We saw this a lot in Charizard decks, but we've also seen it in Lugia decks and a lot of other decks as well. And this is a card that has seen a lot of wins in tournament play, including first at Indonesia Regional League, first at LAIC with Tord's Lugia deck, and then Stuttgart Regionals most recently with Arnie Karjala winning with Charizard. Cynthia's Ambition is a card we don't see a lot these days, but it did see a lot of play in the past. It lets you drop to 5 cards, but if one of your Pokemon was knocked out on the previous turn, you actually got to draw up to 8. I think of this card as a tech in single prize decks like a Regigigas, which won the 2022 Japan Championships, being able to drop to 8, and because your opponent has to take 6 KOs, you were able to play this a lot. But it did see some play in multi-prize decks as well, such as Rapid Strike Urshifu Inteleon with multiple wins thanks to Tord at Special Event Milan and first at Liverpool with Robin Schulz. Magma Basin's a solid card. Lets you accelerate energy to your fire Pokemon, put some damage on them, and a lot of the fire Pokemon at the time got some sort of benefit from getting damage on them. However, compared to the fire acceleration that was in the game beforehand, such as Welder, Magma Basin was not as good as those. And fire Pokemon, while a lot of them did use Magma Basin, it just never took off in the same way that Welder did before. Even so, this card was still a staple in fire decks, and Magma Basin did see some big wins, including in a Gouging Fire deck at the Thailand Premier Ball League. It saw a win at Warsaw Regionals in 2022, and then at Perth Regionals this past year in a Charizard deck. Roseanne's backup lets you recover a crazy amount of stuff from the discard pile, like a tool, a stadium, special energy, like just any energy. This is one of the few ways that the game lets you recover special energy, and there's a lot of recovery options here, but this card saw very little play for the most part, and the few decks that did, this saw like a 1 of in those types of decks. But it has seen some action here and there. It did get a first place finish at Dortmund Regionals in the junior division in a Pidgeot control deck. Tord did use this at Stockholm Regionals, getting a third place finish. This was in order to get double turbo energy, which was a tech in Charizard decks for a little bit, as well as Hero's Cape, and then a second place finish at Perth Regionals with another Pidgeot control deck. Team Yell's Cheer was a staple of control decks, letting you shuffle up to 3 in any combination of Pokemon and supporter cards, except for Team Yell's Cheer, from your discard pile into your deck. This helps you maintain your resources in order to have the pieces you need to control the match while also preventing yourself from decking out. So there's no surprise that we saw this a lot in control decks, including that first place finish at Bogota in the Snorlax deck, at Stockholm in Snorlax with Azul, and then also Orlando Regionals, Liam Halliburton got a first place finish with Charizard, and this was being used to get stuff like Turo Scenario at the time when Snorlax was going crazy and Charizard needed some way of switching out. So Team Yell's Cheer was going to be a way of recycling some key pieces like Turo Scenario. Double Turbo Energy is going to be one of the biggest losses in this rotation, losing 2 colorless energy while also losing 20 damage, but the losing 20 damage is well worth it for the extra energy attachment. And fun fact, this card was in the World Championship winning deck every year it was legal. In the first year, it was Arceus. Second year, it was in Mew VMAX. The third year, it was in Iron Thorns. And besides those 3 decks, there are a number of decks in the format right now that are using double turbo energy, and they don't necessarily have the best replacement for it. Now, will we see a double turbo equivalent? Possibly. Maybe the Pokemon Company just says Neo Upper Energy. I know it's not the same thing. Maybe they say that's the only double energy I want in the format right now. Or maybe we'll see some other sort of double energy arrive. And it'd be a pretty reasonably safe bet that we'll get some sort of double energy at some point, but who knows when. Next up, a massively impactful set in Astral Radiance. Palkia V-Star is one of the strongest Pokemon that is rotating out, and it has one of the best resumes here. It's got 32 top 8 appearances, including 2 wins, 4 international wins, including 23 appearances in top 8s, and this card was absolutely ridiculous. High HP, amazing attack in subspace swell, where for only 2 energy you could do upwards of 260 damage. For the entirety of its life, it had access to Choice Belt, where you were doing an extra 30 damage on Pokemon V. So for the most part, you were hitting 290 damage on most of the decks in the game, and that was incredible. And then you had access to Star Portal to accelerate energy to itself or other water Pokemon, so this thing could power itself up or power up Greninja for that bench snipe. It had access in that first year to Inteleon and Shady Dealings. So at that point in 2022, Palkia was at the peak of its powers with a billion damage, a bench sniper, a really strong attack to the active, and then Shady Dealings being able to draw any trainer cards you wanted. It was the deck to beat, and it only lost out to Arceus with Flying Pikachu because Flying Pikachu was a pretty hard counter to Palkia. And even so, Palkia was an incredible deck that had an amazing run. When the Shady Dealings line rotated out, it kind of saw a lull. We saw it teched into decks like Goldengo for a little bit, but right now Palkia is doing very well, whether you're playing it with Terapagos and you're using Area Zero Underdepths to make it swing for big damage, or you're playing it with Dusknoir for the extra explosion damage. And there's some big highlights on its resume, including a first place at Melbourne Regionals, first place at Special Event Buenos Aires, and then 4th at the 2022 World Championships. Radiant Greninja might be the single best card in the Sword and Shield era. It was actually the single most played card in Pokemon TCG Live. Its utility in so many decks just makes them better, whether it was for that concealed cards ability where you get to discard an energy, draw 2 cards, and this helped you draw more cards while also getting discard synergy, where there were a lot of decks that wanted energy in the discard pile for whatever reason. And then its snipe attack, Moonlight Shuriken, was really strong as well. Being able to snipe out 2 smaller targets for 90 damage apiece made it very useful in so many different matchups, and a lot of decks had Radiant Greninja in them, including Tord's second place Gardevoir deck at the World Championships. It won the 2022 World Championships in the junior division, and then a first place finish at the Korean League Season 3 with Chen Pao. Yeah, this was a card that was in Chen Pao, it was in Palkia decks, it was in Gardevoir decks, it's in Goldengo decks. The list goes on with decks that just love Radiant Greninja, and their decks will move on from Radiant Greninja, but man, it really sucks to see this card go because it's so good. This rotation is going to be taking the entire Regigigas line from us, and this is a very neat deck where if you had all of the Regis in play, Regigigas could accelerate 3 energy to 1 of your Pokemon. And this was a deck that was always a serious contender. Well, it was a serious contender for quite some time, including 11 top 8 finishes at regionals and 3 top 8 finishes at internationals, but it did win more in Japan, including a first place finish at the Japan Championships in 2022 and a Champions League Kyoto title under its belt as well. And it did almost win Charlotte Regionals with a second place finish, and these days we're seeing it being played with Area Zero Underdepths and Pikachu EX. Radiant Heatran is a cooler card than most people give it credit for. Its Raging Blast attack does 70 damage for each damage counter on this Pokemon, and if you're able to attach to it twice from Magma Basin, that's 40 damage, this is doing 280 damage on a single prizer, and does have the potential to one-hit KO everything in the game. It was probably a little too clunky, especially in a world where Radiant Charizard existed, but this was a cool attacker that did see some play here and there. My favorite use of this was in the Arceus Rayquaza deck that happened around this time last year, just before rotation. Players found this combo of Arceus V-Star with Rayquaza V-Max, and Radiant Heatran was there as your endgame sweeper, and it was such a cool combo and a really fun deck to play. But unfortunately, it just didn't see a lot of play outside of that. Still had a couple of decent finishes here, though, including 14th place at Special Event Bologna and 37th at Milwaukee Regionals in an Arceus Charizard deck. Starmie V was kind of a cool tech attacker in water decks. For 2 water energy, you did 50 damage for each energy attached to all of your opponent's Pokemon. In particular, against Arceus decks, you could have Starmie V just take massive one-hit KOs, when oftentimes those types of decks just had tons of energy on the board. It never saw a lot of play, but it did see a win in 2022 in Christian Hasanabe's Palkia deck back at Melbourne Regionals. I think that's the one where, like, if you can find it, I'm pretty sure the top top 8 of that particular tournament was all 8 Palkia decks. It was hilarious. We also saw it get 8th at the World Championships in 2023 in the Seniors Division, as well as a 4th place finish in a Palkia Inteleon deck at the Japan Championships. Luxray V was a neat tech in control decks, or at least decks that were looking for some level of control. Its Fang Snipe attack did 30 damage, and you got to discard a trainer card from your opponent's hand. And this was mostly in control decks like Snorlax Stall or Pidgeot Control, but we did see players experiment with this in other types of decks as well, including a 3rd place finish at Peoria Regionals in a Mew VMAX deck. Gallade was a decent card. It has a really cool ability, Buddy Catch, where you get to grab a supporter card from your deck and put it into your hand, and that's nice. Its attack, though, was a little underwhelming, only doing 160 damage, and you have to move energy off of it. And it even kind of made sense to play it in Gardevoir, potentially as a tech option to grab those supporter cards, but it never really stuck in that way. We did see it get 3rd place at the Philippines Regionals in a Gardevoir deck, but its biggest success was at NAIC, where Arceus Regidrago in the Juniors Division, of all things. Shoutouts to Drake Z. I should have put the Juniors tag on the slide here, but this was the Junior Championship where Gallade won it with Arceus and Regidrago V-Star. Decidueye V-Star is not very good. Its Somersault Feathers attack for 1 fighting and 2 colorless does 160 damage, and you can discard up to 3 energy to do another 30 more damage for each card you discard. So 160 plus, like, you do up to 250 damage. And then its V-Star power to draw up to 8 cards, not that great either. And yet this card has a World Championships under its belt. Andre Scubal ran this as a fighting counter to hit other Arceus decks for weakness, and there was a very brief window of time where people were playing this in their Arceus Flying Pikachu decks as a counter to other Arceuses, and that was very short-lived. Pretty much after Worlds, no one was putting Decidueye in their decks. But regardless, I can't tell the story of this era of cards without talking about the Decidueye that basically showed up to win the World Championships and dipped. Darkrai V-Star is probably one of the most disappointing cards of this block. Players had high hopes that this was going to be a meta-changing card with its Dark Pulse attack being able to do 30 more damage for each Dark Energy attached to all of your Pokemon. We had Dark Patch in the format as well, and unfortunately it just never lived up to the hype. It was a little too clunky relative to the other attackers in the game to really find its footing. It did get a random top 8 at Fresno Regionals, but also did see a little more success out internationally, where it got 2nd at Champions League Kyoto in a Roaring Moon deck. And yeah, we should actually talk about that, where Darkrai didn't really find its footing as its own deck, but it did see some play in Roaring Moon as a 1/1 tech, where that Star Abyss ability lets you grab 2 item cards from your discard pile, put them back into your hand, and oftentimes that was used to grab Dark Patches so that you could attach extra energy to your Dark Pokemon. While we're here, we should talk about Dark Patch as well, allowing you to attach a Dark Energy from your discard pile onto your bench Dark Pokemon. It's a very big piece in a number of meta-relevant decks, including Roaring Moon EX. Some Ancient Box decks play this as well. And then before, a couple of rotations ago, this won Charlotte Regionals in an Eternatus deck. Dark Patch has rotated out before and then come back. Maybe there'll be a world where it comes back again. I would not hold my breath on Dark Patch coming back anytime soon. The gap between the last time we saw Dark Patch and this time we got it back was almost 10 years. So we'll have to find other ways to accelerate Dark Energy. I know Roaring Moon does have access to Sada's Vitality. If you're not an Ancient deck, you can use the Secret Art card, Janine's Secret Art, as a way of accelerating energy, but it's not. I know it's not the same thing, but it is something. Dark Patch going away is going to be a big loss for Dark decks, and we'll see if the Pokemon Company wants to give Dark decks this type of energy acceleration again in the near future. Dialga V-Star is a card that took a really long time to find its footing, and arguably it lost its footing pretty much as soon as it found its footing. It is a deck that has It's a lot of fun to play. In the early days, people were playing it with Celebrations Mew and Scoop Up Net and Metal Saucers and just doing these really wacky combos to accelerate energy to Dialga V-Star. It was a lot of fun to play. It was very convoluted, and it never really found its footing in a competitive environment. However, it did see a bit more play in a Lost Box format, and eventually, with the release of Metang in 2024, finally found its first regional championship win in Indianapolis with Andrew Hedrick piloting their Dialga and Metang deck. Unfortunately, that's pretty much the last time we saw Dialga in a competitive setting. It's kind of fallen by the wayside, but we are seeing it actually more in Archaludon decks these days. I'm not sure Archaludon's going to be the best way to play. At this point, it's probably the best way to play Dialga V-Star. It remains to be seen how good Archaludon Dialga is going to be as a combo, but it's still getting day twos here and there, and we'll see if Archaludon can carry Dialga through rotation on a high note. Mightyena was the first of many Mew VMAX counters that Pokemon put in when they realized that Mew VMAX was kind of a busted deck. Its ability Hustle Bark states that if your opponent has any Pokemon VMAX in play, this Pokemon's attacks cost 3 less. So basically, you did 160 damage for 0 energy. And yes, you could do this on like any other VMAX in the game, but because you were hitting Mew VMAX for weakness, this was pretty much targeted to just Mew VMAX. And a couple of decks did run this card, but mostly it was in Zoroark box as their one-of tech for Mew VMAX, and both times its 2 highlights were just outside of top 8. Before Mimikyu, we had Miltank as our basic wall Pokemon. This would prevent attacks from Pokemon V, and this kind of fell off the face of the earth once Pokemon EX showed up because Miltank could not protect against those attacks. But when it was just Pokemon V, this card was a menace. It had higher HP than Mimikyu, so it was a little harder to KO, and its attack was actually pretty good. Route did 10 plus 20 more damage for each of your opponent's bench Pokemon, so you were doing like 110, and oftentimes you'd play a double turbo energy on here to power this up, but still 90 damage on a Pokemon that Pokemon V can't knock out is very annoying to deal with. And it does have some success under its belt, including a first place finish at Toronto Regionals in 2022, Piper Lapine piloting an insane Mewtwo V Union control deck. Definitely go check that out on Limitless if you've got a chance. Also finding some success in Blissey, like Bliss Tank was a term that people were using at the time to describe Blissey V with Miltank as a deck, and then in other control decks like Yveltal Control that Sander Wojcik played at Liverpool Regionals, getting a top 8 finish. Had I done this list at any other time, Oranguru V would not have made it. This is a card that has seen basically no play until very recently, where the advent of Cloth and Terapagos and the new Latias that makes retreating for free makes this card a lot better. Its ability backorder lets you grab 2 tools when Oranguru V's in the active, and when comboed with Latias, you can just pivot out the Oranguru and then go into your attacker while giving you an opportunity to grab some extra tools along the way. And we're likely, as long as Cloth stays meta relevant between now and rotation, Oranguru will probably continue to see some play. Radiant Hisuian Sneasler is probably getting played more now than it ever has before. Thanks to the advent of Terapagos and Cloth, Radiant Hisuian Sneasler finds itself as a bench sitter there, adding extra poison to those attacks. However, before then, it actually got a first place finish at Charlotte Regionals with Eternatus Wheezing. Weirdeer V was a cool attacker in the decks that could run it. It was basically just one deck that could run it. It was Lugia. Shadow Rider could run it as well, but Shadow Rider kind of fell off the face of the earth very early on in its life, and Weirdeer was just like an odd tech here and there. But in Lugia decks, where you were oftentimes flooding the board with energy, you could pivot Weirdeer in and take big one-hit KOs on pretty much anything in the game, so long as you had the energy to cover that Psy-Shield Bash attack. This has a number of first-place finishes in Lugia decks, including at the World Championships in the Seniors Division, Sacramento Regionals, and then the Philippines Premier Ball League, where Adrian Velasco won with Lugia. Irida's a fantastic supporter card. Lets you grab a water Pokemon and an item card from your deck and put it into your hand. Pretty much every water deck is playing at least 2 to 4 copies of this, oftentimes 4 copies, so you can grab that water Pokemon and an item card. And there are even some decks that weren't water decks that played Irida, such as Kenneth Gilman's Miraidon deck that recently got second place at Sacramento. He would use it to grab stuff like Luminion and Greninja while also getting an item like Electric Generator. But its biggest claims to fame, I think, were that first place finish in the seniors division of the 2022 World Championships, where Liam Halliburton won with Palkia and Teleon. Liam Halliburton is now in the Masters division and also crushing it. And then first place, Piper Levine in Baltimore got a first place finish with Charizard in Teleon. And I'm pretty sure this is the Charizard, this is the Radiant Charizard, where Radiant Charizard was the only attacker in the deck, and you could spam that over and over again with recovery items. It's a really cool deck. Really hard to play, though. Cylene's effect is incredibly powerful. You flip 2 coins and put cards from your discard pile on top of your deck based on the number of heads you hit, and in particular, this gave us the opportunity to recover cards that just had no other way of recovering them. And because of that, this was a card that was in a number of top placing decks, mostly in Mew VMAX, but also saw some play in Snorlax and Goldengo. Roxanne was a card that you had 1 of, maybe 2 in your deck, and it was a card that is great for comebacks. If your opponent had 3 prizes or fewer remaining, you could play Roxanne, and both players shuffle their hands into their deck. You draw 6 cards, they draw 2 cards, allowing you to potentially make some big comebacks. This has won in recent months at Dortmund Regionals in a Dragapult deck. NAIC 2024, Andrew Hedrick won with Lost Box and Roxanne in their deck. And then even going all the way back to 2022, Hale Obernolte won Salt Lake City Regionals with Roxanne in an Arceus Gudra deck. Heavy Ball is one of the few cards in the current format that lets us interact with our prizes, and it's certainly the best and most played one. Lets us grab a basic Pokemon from our prizes and put it into our hand. And yeah, this has seen a number of big wins, including at the 2022 Japan Championships and Regigigas. That's a deck that has a lot of basic Pokemon that you want to fish out of your prizes. It saw a first place win at Brisbane Regionals in a really funky Frostmoth and Teleon deck, and then also got first in 2024 in Gardevoir. Canceling Cologne is one of the coolest cards in the game, and we're unfortunately losing it in this round of rotation. This is a card that helps us cancel out our opponent's active Pokemon's abilities, and most of the time we are using this to attack through walling Pokemon like a Mimikyu or a Cornerstone Mask Ogerpon. This is oftentimes used on Manaphy so that we can bench snipe around it. Regardless, Canceling Cologne is an incredibly powerful card, and we kind of don't have an alternative to this going forward. I'm sure we'll see something added to the game that can help us cancel out abilities here and there, but without Canceling Cologne, I'm very curious to see how much of a power spike these sort of walling decks get. And yeah, during its time, we have seen it take big wins, in particular at the 2024 World Championships. It won in an Iron Thorns deck, also got a special event Bogota win in a Regidrago deck, and then going all the way back to the VMAX days in 2022, Makani Tran got 4th place at Baltimore Regionals with Canceling Cologne in their Ice Rider Palkia deck. If you are playing a deck with basic Pokemon, you are probably playing Switch Cart instead of Switch. Not only do you get to switch, but you get to do a little bit of healing on your basic Pokemon as well. And this saw a first place win in Tord's Sablezard list in 2022. That was kind of the breakout moment for Lost Box when Tord won that tournament, showing players how powerful Lost Box can be. Most recently, we have seen it at Perth Regionals in a Cloth Terapagos deck, and then at the World Championships this year, Jesse Parker got to 3rd place with Miraidon and Switch Cart on board, although Miraidon these days isn't really running Switch cards anymore because we've got Latias EX. Energy Lotto can be a frustrating card. You look at the top 7 cards of your deck, and if you find any energy there, you can grab one, put it into your hand. Oftentimes you were using this to fish for that double turbo energy, but it really sucked when you didn't find the energy you were looking for with Energy Lotto. Still, any deck running special energy in particular was running Energy Lotto because there wasn't really any other good ways of finding special energy for most of this card's life. And even so, it still found some big wins here, including an appearance in Fernando Cifuentes' Iron Thorns deck that won Worlds, and first place at the Japan Championships in 2022 where Regigigas won the whole thing, and Regigigas loved this Energy Lotto card to find that special energy. Most recently at Perth Regionals, we see it in Cloth Terapagos in Hyro Yauka. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. In that Cloth Terapagos deck, looking for that special double turbo energy. For any deck that has zero retreat Pokemon, Feather Ball is a nice tech versus, say, an Ultra Ball where you have to discard 2 cards. You could just play a Feather Ball without any strings attached and grab your zero retreat Pokemon, whether it was a Mew V Max, which Azul did in his 4th placed World Championship deck in 2023, and more recently at Special Event Lima 2024, grabbing that Pidgeot in Terapagos Dusknoir, Giovanni Sasso was able to get a first place victory with Feather Ball in their deck. Temple of Sinnoh is a strong card that wreaks havoc on decks that run special energy, whether it is turning a double turbo energy into a single colorless energy or nullifying Legacy Energy's ability to take 1 less prize. This is a card that is going to be missed, and it's got a number of top placements, including first at Special Event Utrecht and first at LAIC 2025. And it's kind of funny, the first one where Arceus Duraludon is playing Temple of Sinnoh, despite the fact that Arceus itself oftentimes uses Temple of Sinnoh to accelerate energy to it. It's kind of a cool tech where once Duraludon's set up, you can turn off the special energy from your opponent and yourself with Temple of Sinnoh, but at that point you've got Duraludon set up with basic energy and you're not worried about your special energy anymore. Gapejaw Bog was primarily made with Zoroark V-Star in mind. This was going to be your way of getting damage onto your own Pokemon so that Zoroark V-Star could swing for maximum damage. And it did work a little bit. It's got a first place finish in Malaysia and a top 8 finish at Peoria Regionals. Unfortunately, Zoroark V-Star was just not consistent enough to work its way into the meta. But yeah, it was still a cool deck, and Gapejaw Bog did kind of serve its purpose. You just kind of needed too many pieces in a specific order to make Zoroark work, and unfortunately Gapejaw Bog just kind of didn't see as much play because of that. It did see a little bit of life in Ting-Lu as well, but Ting-Lu it was fun for like 2 weeks, and then that deck completely fell off the face of the earth. Super Effective Glasses has a very cool effect, letting you turn your double weakness into triple. It never saw too much play, but did see some success here and there. Most recently, we saw it in Cloth Terapagos, where you attach this to your Electrode V, and you are hitting for 300 damage on a Charizard instead of 100, but also saw some play in a Theodore E's Dark Inteleon deck, and then in Lost Box, we saw the Super Effective Glasses come out there as well for a 4th place finish. Very niche card, but did see a little bit of play here and there. Trekking Shoes is such a cool card, so simple as well. Lets you look at the top card of your deck, and then you can either put it into your hand or discard it. Really helped you fly through your deck a little faster. When I think of Trekking Shoes, I mostly think of Roaring Moon, and in particular, this got 2nd place at this past World Championships, but other decks love the Trekking Shoes as well, including Regigigas, Banette Gardevoir, and many more. Any deck that wanted to fly through their cards fast, Trekking Shoes was it. In terms of collector value, Pokemon Go was kind of a flop. It didn't sell very well, and you can still find a ton of Pokemon Go products in stores and some at clearance prices as well. But in terms of gameplay, Pokemon Go is surprisingly impactful, and some of the biggest cards we're losing in this rotation actually come from this set. Pokestop's going to be a huge loss to the game, where having the stadium in play lets you discard the top 3 cards of your deck and then put any items you find there into your hand. There will be times you discard bad stuff, but if you're building a deck that relies a lot on items, Pokestop is fantastic. We saw this stadium get a win at Louisville Regionals with Caleb Gedmer's Raging Bolt deck. Raging Bolt loves running Pokestop. We also saw Chen Pao win the Malaysia Championships with Pokestop in there. And then Mew V Max was another deck that ran Pokestop here and there and got a win in 2022 at Bilbao. Another deck I should throw in here, I didn't highlight it, but Goldengo is another one that absolutely loves Pokestop, trying to find all of those energy retrievals and other items so that Goldengo can swing for 1 billion damage every turn. Radiant Charizard is one of the coolest attackers in the game. Yes, its attack cost is insane, but it comes down for every prize card your opponent has taken. So towards the end game, this is an incredibly efficient attacker swinging for massive damage. This has pretty much any deck that can run fire energy is running Radiant Charizard in it. It's seeing a lot of success in Regidrago right now. It is a staple of Charizard EX decks. And then maybe my favorite moment of Radiant Charizard, and like this was the main attacker in a Inteleon deck where Radiant Charizard is pretty much the only thing swinging for big damage, and Piper Lapine piloted this deck insanely well, won Baltimore Regionals with pretty much this as its only attacker. I wonder if the footage is still online of this match. I would definitely track this down because this is like maybe one of the most incredible feats I have seen in my time watching the Pokemon TCG, is this deck just thriving with basically this one card as its only attacker. Its only real attacker anyway. Radiant Charizard is going to be one of the biggest losses in this rotation. Snorlax Stall might be the single most hated deck in the Pokemon TCG, but man, is it effective. It is a deck that tries to force your opponents to run out of cards by trapping Pokemon that can't attack in the active, right? Any deck could beat Snorlax if they just ran a billion switch cards, and some decks do, but most of them don't, which is where Snorlax preys on the meta and forces people to run out of cards by just trapping Pokemon in the active that your opponents don't want trapped. And it's not a playstyle for everybody, but it is a valid way to play the game, and there are going to be people that really miss this card. Any sort of control deck player is absolutely going to miss Snorlax. And this is a card that actually didn't see a lot of play until Counter Catcher came out over a year later, when Snorlax really got to shine and was able to gust Pokemon up way more easily and trap them. This is a card that's had quite the resume. It's got 22 top 8s in regional championships, including 3 wins, and then 6 appearances in top 8s of international championships. Slowbro is very good at one specific thing. If your opponent has exactly 1 prize card left, you could take 2 prizes with Twilight Inspiration and the attachment of a double turbo energy. This is a card that didn't really see any play outside of Zoroark Box, and that is a really cool archetype that a lot of people love, but it just didn't have the consistency to, unfortunately, like get to the top tables. It did get a top 8 at Indonesia Regional League, but was just outside it multiple times. But this was your endgame attacker in Zoroark Box, and just for context, Zoroark Box was a deck where you could have your stage 1 Zoroark just transform into a Pokemon from your discard pile. So you would transform into different Pokemon that could hit for weakness, or at the end of the game, if your opponent needs 1 more prize, you transform into the Slowbro, attach a double turbo energy, and take 2 prizes and hopefully win the game that way. Zapdos gave your basic lightning Pokemon a 10 damage boost. Now that doesn't seem like a lot, but the math worked very well in its favor, where we ended up going into a meta with Roaring Moon and Iron Hands, both which had 230 HP, and then Miraidon decks had Miraidon and Raikou, which both capped out at 220 damage, so that extra 10 meant a lot, and Zapdos was in a lot of lightning decks, including Jesse Parker's 3rd place build at the 2024 World Championships, and the winning deck at LAIC 2024. Also saw a win at Champions League Sapporo, where Akira Kurosaki won the whole thing with Miraidon. There were other equivalents of this card for fire and water decks with Moltres and Articuno, but those archetypes didn't really need that damage boost, so those ones didn't really see any play. On top of all that, for Zapdos, its electric ball attack was actually not bad for 2 lightning and a colorless, doing 110 damage. Oftentimes, this was your only way of zapping through Mimikyu. In terms of in-person play, Solrock and Lunatone's competitive resume is incredibly short, just 54th at Fort Wayne Regionals back in 2023. But you can't tell the story of the Pokemon TCG without this deck. This was a wildly popular deck online because it was such a cheap deck to build. In PTCGO, it didn't take a lot to get the Solrock and the Lunatone cards, and then this was incredibly powerful as well. You could use Solrock's ability to attach energy to the Lunatone, and then Moon Kinesis eventually could get to a point where you were taking massive one-hit KOs or two-shotting pretty much anything in the game for most of the game. And on top of that, you could use Scoop Up Net so that you could recycle your Solrock and use the ability again to get even more energy on Lunatone. This was I could not stand fighting this deck, but man, it was so popular in the PTCGO days when it was really hard to build meta decks because they were just really expensive trading packs for cards, and this ended up being a go-to deck for a lot of people. And at the time when this first came out, it was incredibly strong online, and it just never really translated to in-person play. But man, this deck was everywhere online. This Ditto card is one of the coolest Pokemon cards of all time. I don't know if you've seen this card in person, but if you pull this card in person, there's actually like other Pokemon on there. The one off the top of my head, it's like a Bidoof, and then there's a little icon to denote there's actually a Ditto underneath, and you actually have to pull the sticker off to reveal that it's actually a Ditto card because the Ditto was hiding underneath. Yeah, it's a whole thing. It's very cool. One of the coolest Pokemon cards you can get in real life and not in digital form. But regardless of how you were playing it, Ditto was kind of cool because it let you copy basic Pokemon attacks from the discard pile. And we saw this card a lot in United Wings. We saw it in this really wacky Miltank Morpeko deck that got top 8 in Baltimore one year. And then in Lost Box decks, this would also be used to copy attacks. And yeah, this ended up being kind of a cool rogue tier card. Slacking V, despite the wonderful resume down here, actually didn't see a lot of play. Its ability made it very annoying to use, but you could turn off that kind of lazy ability with Path to the Peak, making it a very potent attacker. Yes, 4 energy is a lot, but you could power that up with Arceus or Lugia, at which point it became an incredibly strong threat. And its biggest highlight was that in the seniors division of the 2023 World Championships, it won the whole thing in a Lugia deck. Now let's move over to Lost Origin. The impact of this set going away is going to be huge because we're not only just losing cards, we're actually losing an entire gameplay mechanic in the Lost Zone engine. Now, Lost Zone has gone away before and has come back, and it will probably come back again in some point in the future. But for the time being, we're going to be without the Lost Zone for a little bit. Core to the Lost Zone in the Sword and Shield era / Scarlet and Violet era was Comfey. This little flower wreath was a pivotal part of Lost Zone decks, 4 of in every Lost Zone deck, where its flower selecting ability lets you look at 2 cards. You'll put one into your hand and then the other one into the Lost Zone. The more cards you get into the Lost Zone, the more you're able to unlock different moves and abilities for your deck. And of course, the Lost Zone is, once the cards go in the Lost Zone, you have no way of recovering them, unlike your discard pile. So Comfey was a 4 of in every Lost Zone deck, throwing those cards into the discard pile. And I mean, of course, this card had a ton of success with 66 appearances in regional championships in the top 8, and then 35 appearances in international championships with a total of 13 big wins there. And then, yeah, also first place at Peoria Regionals, NAIC, and more on top of that. And then I also highlighted here second place at Louisville Regionals with Michael Davidson's variation of the deck. Yeah, Lost Zone is going to be missed, and yeah, Comfey was a big part of that. Cramorant was the go-to starting attacker, where that Spit Innocently attack for 2 water and a colorless looks terrible, but the fact that you could do this for free if you got 4 cards into the Lost Zone made it a fantastic opening attacker for 0 energy, especially if you were going second. You could pull this off at the first turn of the game and set yourself up with some really nice tempo. And again, this is going to go hand in hand with a lot of the Lost Zone decks. And I should have pointed out in the Comfey one that this is only counting non-Giratina V-Star Lost Box. So if we count those variations as well, we're going to get there's a ton of results. There's even more if we count some of the other archetypes that aren't necessarily Lost Box in the traditional sense. But yeah, Cramorant was in there as a big early game attacker. Really nice tempo, taking out smaller Pokemon as well. Sableye. This card was absolutely insane. Its Lost Mind attack lets you just drop 12 damage counters anywhere you wanted, with as long as you had 10 cards in the Lost Zone, and it was an absolute menace for a long time. There was not a way of stopping that attack until like Paradox Rift, when Jirachi showed up. And for a long time, Sableye just absolutely dominated because there were just so many, you couldn't block it, and you could set up damage in all sorts of weird ways that Sableye could clean up towards the end of the game. Now, as Lost Box has been neutralized with certain other cards that have come in to counter it, we just don't see Sableye as much and don't see the need to necessarily block a Lost Mine. But for any sort of opponents that aren't playing the Jirachi and you're still brave enough to run Lost Box, Sableye, it can absolutely tear decks up. And this was a card that people were wondering, like, maybe we should ban this because it's just too good. And it just took a really long time for Lost Box as a whole to just kind of like slip by the wayside, and it took some hard counters with Kyurem to really slow this deck down. Colress's Experiment was a huge supporter card for Lost Zone decks, letting you look at the top 5 cards of your deck, put 3 into your hand, 2 into the Lost Zone. This card was so good that a number of decks that were not Lost Zone decks also had Colress's Experiment in there because it was just a great way of building your hand without having to let go of any resources, right? Professor's Research, you had to discard your hand in order to draw 7 cards. For Iono, you have to put your hand to the bottom of their deck before you can draw more cards. And Colress's Experiment, yes, you have to put cards on the Lost Zone, but you get to hold everything that's already in your hand and just build on top, which is why we see decks like Arceus Gudra here from Salt Lake City Regionals by Hale Obernolte win with Colress in the deck, as well as Arceus Duraludon in 2023 at Utrecht win with Colress's Experiment, even though it wasn't a Lost Box deck. But of course, we did see this card in every Lost Box deck, and this card was insanely powerful until we saw Kyurem show up, which specifically punished decks that had Colress in the name. Now, Kyurem's probably not going to see much play post-rotation. Yes, there is another Colress card in the format, Colress's Tenacity, but that card is way more situational, and I don't think people... It's not going to be played nearly enough to warrant Kyurem being in any decks post-rotation, at least from what it looks like so far. But Colress's Experiment, phenomenal card. Once you got 7 cards into the Lost Zone, Mirage Gate goes off, letting you attach 2 energy of different types from your deck to your Pokemon in any way you like. And this just opened the door for a lot of different Pokemon with high energy costs to be able to attack. Most recently, Lost Box is running Pikachu EX with those Stellar Terra Pokemon have really weird attack costs with 3 different energy types, and Mirage Gate just says, that's fine, I'll give you 2 of those, no problem. And there were so many different decks and so many Pokemon that could benefit from a Mirage Gate that it opened the door for a lot of different variations of different Lost Boxes to succeed with Mirage Gate. And yeah, losing this form of acceleration is going to suck. I mean, we're losing the whole archetype and it sucks, but this was one of the best parts of Lost Box, was the fact that you could just slap in any sort of attacker into the deck and Mirage Gate could probably make it work. Giratina V-Star was an incredible attacker for a very long time. It's we'll start with the Giratina V actually, because Abyss Seeking was pretty good when you didn't have the comp phase or couldn't use the comp phase. You could throw cards into the Lost Zone with that attack, and then Shred for a grass, colorless, and a psychic just did 160 damage and went through effects of attacks. You could take out stuff like a Mimikyu, and yeah, any sort of walling decks you would shred through. Great in the Snorlax matchup in particular. And then Giratina V-Star was a heavy hitter for a grass, psychic, and colorless. You were doing 280 damage and powering up your Lost Zone by throwing 2 energy into the Lost Zone. So not only were you pretty much one-hit KOing every relevant V-Star in the game and everything below that, you were also getting yourself built up so that you had access to ultimately Sableye Lost Mine, and then Star Requiem for a grass and colorless was just an instant KO if you had 10 or more cards into the Lost Zone, making this an absolutely ferocious attacker. Giratina Lost Zone decks, we had 29 hit regional top 8s, including 3 wins, and then it wasn't able to win on the international stage, but got 16 appearances in the top 8 with some really big wins there as well, with first place at the Champions League Yokohama. We also saw it get 3rd at Worlds, right behind Tord and Vance Kelly. Shoutouts to Michael Promoat for the huge performance there. And then 1st at the Singapore Regional League. And this doesn't even include talking about, and I guess now's the time, Giratina was also used in Arceus Giratina, where Arceus would be your initial attacker, powering up Giratina, throwing energy on the board, and then Giratina could just smash for lost impact over and over again. And one of the coolest things about that deck is you could just put a double turbo energy on a different Pokemon, swing for 280, and then just discard the double turbo without having to move the energy off of the Giratina, letting it swing for 280 over and over again. Unfortunately, this just kind of got power crept out of the game with where it's out, and ultimately I think Kyurem just like crippling the Lost Zone box stuff really hurt it. But Giratina, I've still seen like people playing it online and doing well here and there. Very strong card, and one of the strongest cards from the Sword and Shield era. This single prize Snorlax did not see as much play as Snorlax Stall, but it did have a purpose for a while. Its Thumping Snore attack for 3 colorless energy is a great attack that did 180 damage, and yes, you would be very asleep unless you could play some sort of special energy to negate the effects of this attack, which Lugia decks absolutely did. And for a time, Snorlax was in Lugia decks as a single prize attacker that could do meaningful damage to multi-prize Pokemon or take out single prize Pokemon as well, while being pretty tanky in and of itself. 150 HP on a basic single prize Pokemon is pretty huge. And I think we mostly saw it, or at least for a while, we saw it in Lost Zone box decks as well, including a win at the World Championships in 2023. It won the Worlds and Seniors division. Gabriel F, shoutouts to you, had this in their Lugia deck, but then we also saw this in Azul's OCIC winning Lost Box deck, as well as the deck that won Singapore Regionals in 2022. Yeah, this Snorlax has gotten a lot of good cards. This is one that it's definitely not the Snorlax Stall. Not that good or like defining its own deck, but really solid secondary piece. Lost City was a fantastic stadium that was a real thorn in the side of many different decks. When a Pokemon got knocked out, they would get sent to the Lost Zone instead of back in the discard pile, so you could not recover those Pokemon. And even decks that were not Lost Zone decks would use this stadium to help get rid of really annoying threats. For example, yeah, we've got 3 different decks here that are in the highlights section. Most recently at Worlds in 2024, Fernando Cifuentes had this in their Iron Thorns deck in order to just get some of those your opponent's key Pokemon out of play. And you're an Iron Thorns deck and you only have 4 Pokemon. You don't really care if any of your Pokemon go into Lost City. Then at Utrecht in 2024, Mew VMAX, one of its, I think this might have been its last win before it rotated out, had Lost City in there. In particular, getting Drapion out of play was huge for Mew. And then Arceus Duraludon Umbreon. This was a very cool archetype that didn't last too long before Duraludon and Umbreon rotated out, but very cool deck. And it got first at the Malaysia Championships with that Lost City in there. Cresselia did not have a home when it first came out. This predates the Gardevoir deck, actually. And it was in Lost Origin, and Moonglow Reverse as an attack didn't really have a function at all. It wasn't until Gardevoir EX showed up in Scarlet and Violet where Cresselia had a home. And it's not played as much these days in Gardevoir decks, but when it was very successful, including a first place at the Champions League Nagata in Japan, as well as second place at NAIC, and then second at Worlds in... I loved watching that match between Vance Kelly and Tord Reklev. One of the greatest grand finals, came down to the wire. And yeah, Tord was right there. And Cresselia was a big part of that deck's success at the time. Goodra V-Star is a personal favorite of mine. I remember in the PTCGO days when people thought Goodra was trash and I was able to trade to get these really cheap, and then Goodra started winning and then the price went up and I felt really good for having traded for these when they were worth nothing. Now, I don't think Goodra was ever a serious meta threat. It did have an international championships win. It did have a regional top 8 win, and this is only Lost Zone Goodra. There was Arceus Goodra as well, which we do see here first at Salt Lake City Regionals. But it did have some other big wins as well. Fort Wayne Regionals in 2023 as a Lost Zone deck, as well as EUIC in the Juniors division. Its Rolling Iron attack was always like a little too short. With 200 damage, you are taking out smaller support multi-prize Pokemon like a Squawkabilly and a Rotom, and you would take 80 less damage, which is awesome. But yeah, you just weren't taking enough single prize hit or multi-prize one-hit KOs, which is kind of where the format has been for a while now. And you were kind of hoping that you could just tank and survive a little longer. Moisture Star was great for that, where you could also just heal all your damage, and that could help you stay in the game a little longer. I think as a deck by itself, Goodra just kind of wasn't good enough more often than not, despite the fact that it did get some wins here and there, and it is a personal favorite deck of mine to play. I think these days it sees most of its success as a attacker that Regidrago could copy. And I should also note that Giratina V-Star, which we also covered, does have a home these days in Regidrago as well, although all of these cards are rotating soon. Yeah, Goodra, I love Goodra V-Star. Electrode V was a bad card until it found a home in Cloth, where that Tantrum Blast could do 100 damage for each special condition affecting this Pokemon, and then you pair it with the super effective glasses and you could one-hit KO Charizard EX. So there were a couple of things that needed to happen. We needed to see super effective glasses show up, and then also see Charizard become popular in order to make this card relevant, and it has seen some success even as recently as this year, where the new version of Cloth with Terapagos, this is in there specifically as a counter to Charizard, but it can take out smaller support multi-prize Pokemon like a Squawkabilly as well. But for the most part, we are seeing this as a tech include to knock off Charizard EX. Drapion V might be the most aggressive and overt counters to a very specific deck that the game has ever seen. This is, on the surface, it's dynamic tail attack for 190 damage, 4 energy, doing 60 damage to one of your Pokemon is not good. No, not at all. You would never power this up on your own accord for the most part. I know there's a couple of Lugia lists that will run Drapion and accelerate energy, but for the most part, this was here to be a Mew VMAX counter, where its Wild Style ability makes the attack cost go down 1 colorless for each of your opponent's Single Strike, Rapid Strike, or Fusion Strike Pokemon in play. Mew VMAX was built almost entirely of Fusion Strike Pokemon, and you kind of needed to have multiple Genesects and Mews, and you basically were attacking a Fusion Strike deck for free every single time, and Drapion was one-hit KOing Mew V or Mew VMAX every single time as well. And because of that, because of the popularity of Mew and how easy Drapion was to splash into a deck, that pretty much every deck was running at least one Drapion to counter Mew. Some were even running 2 Drapion so that if one got sent to the Lost Zone, you had another one ready to go. And some Mew VMAX decks were even running Drapion as a counter to other Mew VMAX decks. This actually changed the way that Mew VMAX was played, because you could turn off Wild Style with Path to the Peak, which made Path to the Peak very popular in Mew decks in order to slow down the threat of Drapion. Now, it was never perfect. There were times that they could vacuum that away, but Drapion was just a persistent thorn in the side of Mew VMAX until it rotated out. And there have been, like, some decks have still run Drapion. There's a handful of Drapions I've seen in tournament results, in Lugia decks specifically, to hit Psychic Pokemon like a Gardevoir. But these days, Drapion is pretty much it might as well not be in the game at this point, ever since Mew left. Delphox V is a card that on the surface feels like, yeah, this should be a Lost Zone card, and it never really found a home in Lost Zone decks, but it did find a home in some Arceus decks and sort of Fire box decks, where that magical fire attack doing 120 to the active and then 120 to a bench target was really nice. We've seen similar attacks like this, whether it was Greninja or Rapid Strike Urshifu, and yes, this one's a little more limited because you have to attack the active, but in certain cases this attack was pretty awesome. We saw this in Gouging Fire decks, where it has won the Thailand Premier Ball League tournament. It won in lots of Asian territories. Yeah, the whole highlights here is all Asian territories, with the Philippines as well as the Korean League. But I will say Delphox is a fun card, and the times I've played decks like a Gouging Fire and had the opportunity to use this card, it was pretty awesome. Radiant Gardevoir is certainly not on the level of some of the best Radiant Pokemon we have seen. But for a time, this was pretty helpful, where you took 20 less damage from your opponent's Pokemon V, and there were times where this would prevent you from getting one-hit KO'd, which was absolutely fantastic. So we did see this get some big wins here, including in Arceus Duraludon at EUIC 2023, Piper Lapine with the cool Mewtwo control deck, one with Gardevoir helping keeping Mewtwo and the other Pokemon in that deck alive a little longer, and then Hale Obernolte using it in their Arceus Goodra deck to make Goodra even tankier. Thornton was a really neat card, which lets you substitute a basic Pokemon in play and swap it out with one from your discard pile, keeping all other effects. And we would use this to surprise our opponents with Pokemon that they didn't see coming, or bring in, like, run shorter lines of Pokemon so that we can just run Thornton to bring them back in so that we could squeeze other cards into our deck. Most recently, we saw this win at Stuttgart in a Charizard deck. We've also seen it win at Special Event Lima with a Terapagos Dusknoir deck. And then going back a little bit, Thailand Regional League, we saw Thornton in a Rapid Strike Urshifu deck. Yeah, I feel like this is a card, it was only really a one of in a handful of decks. It feels like a card that could have been used more, but in the decks that did use it, they used it very effectively. Rotom V is a staple of current play, but this is a card that actually did not have a home for a long time. It wasn't until players figured out the combo with Arven and Forest Seal Stone that Rotom found a spot in the meta as part of the Charizard deck. And that instant charge ability is so good, letting you draw 3 cards at the end of your turn, and oftentimes you just use this on your first turn of the game, and that's all you needed it for. But its attack is actually kind of cool. For 2 lightning energy, you do 40 damage, plus you can put any number of tools from your discard pile into the Lost Zone, and then that does 40 more damage. Some people were... So the thing about Rotom V is that there was also a Rotom V-Star, and I have to cut the Rotom V-Star from this presentation, but Rotom V-Star came out months later than Rotom V, and it was basically the same attack, except you started with 80 damage instead of 40. And I actually really love Rotom V-Star. Really fun Pokemon with a really cool attack, and I love it as a rogue tier deck. I've always enjoyed covering it. And Rotom V, of course, by a landslide, has gotten way more play, but Rotom V-Star is one of the coolest rogue decks that the Sword and Shield era has, and before it rotates out, I implore you to give it a shot. Lost Vacuum is an incredibly powerful card, letting you throw a Stadium or a tool into the Lost Zone. Before this was here, we had tools like Tool Jammer and Tool Scrapper. Lost Vacuum kind of took over both of those because it was a way of permanently getting him out of the game, and you could drop a Stadium or a tool, giving you a little more flexibility. And this was in multiple World Championship lists, and it won a ton of tournaments and was a staple card in many different decks. We have the Jamming Tower as sort of a way of at least disabling tools temporarily. I'm curious to see what sort of other tool removal tools we get going forward. I'm sure we will, but for the time being, post-rotation, it looks like we're just going to have to use Jamming Tower as a way of getting Stadiums out of play. But Lost Vacuum was awesome for its time. Zoroark V-Star is I think it's a really tantalizing card. It always seemed to have a ton of potential, and its attack, Ticking Curse, lets you do 50 damage for each of your Pokemon that has any damage counters on it, and it had the potential to hit really big numbers, but just the combo of having to damage all of your Pokemon and then get the double turbo energy, at which point you were already like nerfing your damage a little bit as well. And yes, there were builds that ran double turbo and regular energy as well. It never really found its potential, even in Stellar Crown, where we could expand the benches to 8, at which point it seemed like Zoroark could one-hit KO anything. That never really materialized. It did see a win in Malaysia in 2022 and got a top 8 in 2022 as well, but this Zoroark just as a deck never really lived up to its potential. Gengar pretty much only had uses in Zoroark V-Star. It was a way of getting damaged Pokemon into play. That Netherworld Gate ability pretty much allowed you to resurrect a Gengar from the discard pile with damage counters on it in order to boost Zoroark V-Star's damage by 50. Its attack is actually not that bad though. Screaming Circle for 1 psychic energy lets you put 2 damage counters on your opponent's active Pokemon for each of your opponent's bench Pokemon. So before Area Zero Underdepths, that was a way of getting 100 damage counters on there, which is kind of cool, and its tournament results were basically whatever Zoroark V-Star was able to achieve. Kyurem VMAX was kind of Chien-Pao before Chien-Pao. Its Glaciated World ability helped accelerate energy to itself, and then Max Frost for 120, for 3 water energy did 120 damage, and then you could discard any amount of energy from this Pokemon, and you did 50 more damage for each card you discarded this way. So you could potentially build up to one-hit KO territory. You could use Palkia to accelerate extra energy. In the early days, you could use Melanie to accelerate extra energy here as well. Unfortunately, this was the VMAX in a time when VMAXs were starting to get phased out, and it didn't really see a lot of success for very long. Yes, it got a win at the Indonesia Regional League and a couple of big finishes in 2022, but pretty much once rotation happened, Kyurem fell off the face of the earth and kind of got power crept out of the game. Aerodactyl V and V-Star they did not see a lot of play for the majority of its life, but there was a moment in time where this card did see a lot of play. Aerodactyl V-Star in particular, that Ancient Star attack, where until this Pokemon leaves play, it gains an ability that has the effect of your opponent's Pokemon V in play, except Aerodactyl V-Star have no abilities. And this was huge for shutting off things like Lugia V-Star, where you could not summon the Archeops into play. Genesect could not draw cards. Lumineon couldn't do anything. Arceus couldn't do anything. So if you were able to go first and then on your second turn pop Aerodactyl V-Star before your opponent could get rolling, this was absolutely devastating. And yes, you could knock out the Aerodactyl, but assuming you were able to pull this attack off fast enough, your opponent wouldn't be set up in time, and then you could just retreat Aerodactyl to the bench and carry on with your onslaught. So we did see this win in San Diego Regionals in 2023 in a Vikavolt deck. It was Vikavolt V of all things, and then also saw some play at Special Event Puerto Rico in a Lost Box deck, and then at the Sydney Regionals, Natalie Millar actually had it in Mew VMAX and got 9th place. Mawile had a very specific use. That Tempting Trap attack lets you trap opposing Pokemon in the after spot so they can't retreat, and in certain control decks you would use this just as a way of forcing your opponent to run out of cards. You trap a supporting Pokemon in there and exploit the fact that they don't have enough switch cards, they can't retreat, and then you just win the game. And as you can see by its highlights here, it has a number of first place wins in mostly control decks, but I want to point out here the Curitiba Regionals 2023, where William Azevedo had it in their Charizard deck. This didn't last very long as a tech, but I do want to point out that this very specific tournament where Mawile was in Charizard was also the advent of the Arven Zard list that we see now. When people figured out Arven plus 4 Seal Stone plus a Pokemon V, that was the event, and that was the deck that put Charizard on the map. Because before then we were running it with like Arceus and stuff, and it wasn't that great, but Charizard really hit its stride with this tournament, and Mawile in there as well. Pidgeot V was a pretty terrible attacker, but it had a very specific use of preventing you from decking out, where you could just put this on your bench and then you could shuffle it. When it's on your bench, you can shuffle it back into your deck, pretty much ensuring that you never run out of cards, because you'll always have that Pidgeot V to put onto your bench and then bring it back out. This was a card mostly used in control decks. It saw play in Snorlax and got a couple of big regional wins here. And then, yeah, in Peoria Regionals, we also saw it make an appearance in a Lost Box deck. Gift Energy was a nifty energy card which helped you draw up to 7 cards when the Pokemon this was attached to was knocked out. Now, this was a card that was actually bugged in PTCGO for a long time, and because of that, Regigigas decks were underrepresented in the online space because this card just didn't work properly. But for in-person play, it helped Regigigas win Champions League Kyoto. But outside of Regigigas, we mostly saw this card in Lugia V-Star decks, including at least one win at a regional championships. I'm sure it's more than that, and even a win at Worlds in the seniors division. Box of Disaster had a very specific use case where the Pokemon V this card was attached to got knocked out, had full HP, and then got knocked out. You got to drop 8 damage counters on the attacking Pokemon. And this pretty much saw play as a counter to Gardevoir decks, where they would put a bunch of damage onto their attacker, at which point they would swing for massive damage. And Box of Disaster was a way of retaliating on those low HP Pokemon. After they've knocked you out, the Box of Disaster triggers, and then you knock out their attacker as well, helping to maintain some sort of momentum. Vance Kelly had this in their World Championship Mew VMAX deck, specifically to counter against Gardevoir, which helped out because they ran into Gardevoir with Tord in the Grand Finals. Also saw a win at Special Event Utrecht, which I think was the last win for Mew VMAX before it rotated out. And then even outside of our Mew VMAX decks, we did see it get top 8 at Portland Regionals in an Arceus deck. Panic Mask, to me, is a card that is synonymous with Serena EX decks, where you get to prevent all damage done to this Pokemon from Pokemon that have 40 HP or less remaining. But in the tournament world, this card didn't, I mean, Serena didn't really do much of anything in the tournament scene, but it did see some play. And we saw it get top 8 at Buenos Aires with a Goodra deck. Also in Arceus Duraludon Umbreon, we saw it get 7th place. And then in Sacramento, it got 23rd in 2023 in a Charizard Arceus deck. Again, Charizard decks before Arven came out, or like before Arven and Forest Heal Stone was a thing, we were running it with Arceus, trying to figure out some stuff. And I guess Panic Mask is, I'm not sure the exact reason for Panic Mask in that particular build, but hey, they got top 32 at a regional, so yeah, good for them. The last major set in the Sword and Shield era was Silver Tempest, and everybody's going to remember this. Well, I guess there's 2 reasons to remember this for now. In the early days, it was the Lugia set, where Lugia was quite possibly the single most broken deck in the history of the Pokemon TCG. But years later, Regidrago from this set would rise up and is now the current best deck in the game, and will have had a run of almost a year being at or near the top of the competitive scene. So to say that Silver Tempest was impactful in the tournament scene is underselling it by quite a bit. Regidrago V-Star is a card that did not see a lot of play for a long time. Cannot stress, yes, the Apex Dragon, as we know now, is a phenomenal attack. Legacy Star, phenomenal V-Star power. But this just didn't have the right pieces for a long time. Players were trying to use this with like Leafeon V to help accelerate energy. We were copying stuff like Duraludon VMAX, and hey, these were okay. We were playing it with Arceus, but it just didn't have the right pieces to be a top tier deck until Twilight Masquerade, and we saw Teal Mask Ogerpon show up as a form of energy acceleration, and then Dragapult EX come in as a really solid attack for Regidrago to copy. And now we see Regidrago just absolutely dominating the tournament scene, and there's going to be a massive impact once Regidrago rotates out, because the entire meta as we currently see it kind of revolves around the presence of Regidrago V-Star being in the game. And while it hasn't always been a competitive deck, for most of its life it hasn't been, what it's been able to achieve in the last 9 months or so has been phenomenal. We see it get 44 top 8 appearances, including 6 wins, 14 international top 8 appearances, including 2 wins, and most recently we saw it win at Toronto Regionals, where there was like 5 or so Regidragos in top 8. It was absolutely crazy. and we also saw it won at Worlds this year in the seniors division, and then at Lille Regionals, James Cox won with Regidrago as well. Again, tons of wins, and the game is going to be shaken up quite a bit once Regidrago rotates out. And I feel a kind of way, because I loved Regidrago before it became cool. You can check my channel. We have tons of videos from before it became the deck to beat, and then it finally became the deck to beat. And I don't know, maybe I'm just a Pokemon TCG hipster, but the era of Regidrago being the best deck, well, I'm still happy for my king here. I don't know. It kind of didn't hit the same one once Regidrago became like the de facto deck. And that's just a personal thing for me. I haven't always felt that way for top decks. Mew VMAX is my all-time favorite deck, and that was the top deck, and I've always loved that deck, even when people were targeting and hating it like crazy. So it's just more personal feelings that I need to sort through. But the Regidrago, ultimately I'm happy to see Regidrago finally live up to its potential and have an amazing tournament run here. It's kind of crazy we're talking about Regidrago before we talk about Lugia, because at Silver Tempest, Lugia was literally the most broken deck of all time. It was in an era of 3 prize Pokemon, and Lugia V-Star was a 2 prizer that could bring out 1 prizers that could instant KO 3 prize Pokemon. You cannot understate how insanely powerful Lugia V-Star was at its peak. And for newer players that started maybe in the Scarlet and Violet era, we have not had a deck that is as good as Lugia V-Star was at that point in time. We've had nothing, right? Charizard was not that good. Regidrago was not that good. Gardevoir was not that good. Nothing was as good as Lugia V-Star was that we've seen in the modern era. This was the last tier 0 deck. Absolutely disgusting. You played Lugia, or you played a deck that maybe kind of countered Lugia, and that was the only way you won. 85 top 8 regional top 8 finishes, including 11 wins, 40 international top 8s, including 4 wins. It won at a lot of different events, including LAIC 2022-2023 with Tord, Joinville, Champions League in Japan. This won like everywhere, and everyone was playing this deck. And even after rotation and it lost a bunch of pieces, we still saw Lugia see some success with single strike variants. We saw it with colorless variants. We've seen it with the Cinccino in modern times. It's not as strong now as it was before, but still a solid competitive deck. And yeah, Lugia V-Star is an incredibly powerful deck that will definitely has made a name for itself on the way as it leaves the format. And yeah, it's not necessarily the top tier deck it once was, but it pretty much always found a way to at least be competitive throughout. Can't speak to Lugia without talking about Archeops. Now, fossil Pokemon are generally horrible in the Pokemon TCG. They take too much work to set up, but Lugia V-Star, having that V-Star power, allowing it to cheat the Archeops into play, made this one of the most broken energy acceleration engines the game has ever seen. Primal Turbo lets you accelerate 2 special energy cards to one of your Pokemon, and that just facilitated so much crazy offense that it was unprecedented for the time, especially in that Silver Tempest era, where we had a lot of attackers that, quite frankly, should not have been paired with Archeops and the special energy at the time, because unlike the Scarlet and Violet era, we had type-specific energy, like Psychic special energy, a Lightning-specific energy, and that broke Lugia wide open for a whole bunch of crazy attackers. These days, energy is pretty much like Rainbow with some weird restrictions, or almost entirely colorless to kind of nerf what Archeops did. But in that Silver Tempest time, absolutely nuts. And yeah, finding those Archeops to get them in the discard pile was a make or break for this deck. And as strong as it was, like, it was absolutely maddening when you could not get the Archeops down on turn 2, which is one of the reasons, like, I just never I never loved the deck because of how all or nothing Lugia decks were. But man, if you could get hot more often than not, like you got the 2 Archeops down turn 2, you're probably winning the game. Kirlia is one of the biggest losses in this format. Its refinement ability is absolutely amazing. Lets you discard a card, draw 2 cards. We are seeing this ability return in Zoroark EX, but the context in which Zoroark EX works is going to be different. That's a multi-prize Pokemon, it's dark type, and Kirlia is like the perfect partner for the Gardevoir EX that we see today. And there's some major question marks about what Gardevoir is going to look like post-rotation once this Kirlia card goes away. It's so important to help you draw more cards and discard energy so that Gardevoir can reattach that or attach that energy to its attackers. And I am reluctant to completely write off Gardevoir. I think Gardevoir's ability is just way too insane to say that this card will never come back, but Kirlia is going to hurt Gardevoir decks really badly when it goes away. And I think we'll have to see what new cards come out, or if players just kind of rethink what Gardevoir is and how it works. And maybe we're playing a lot of Professor's Research and Rare Candy, and we're just trying to turbo straight into Gardevoir. I don't know what Gardevoir is going to look like, but it's going to look different without Kirlia in it. Cobalion seems like a weird card. It doesn't have a very good attack, but its Justified Law ability made you do 30 more damage to your opponent's active dark Pokemon. This became a tech card in a lot of decks trying to hit Charizard EX. Most notably, it got a first place finish at Special Event Mexico City, where Ancient Box was a deck that had Cobalion in it, so that you could get to a point where you could one-hit KO Charizard EX. And we mostly saw this card in Ancient Box, but we did see it appear in a Lugia deck in 2024, where it was again trying to help make Charizard a little easier to KO. Vulpix V-Star is an interesting Pokemon with a really cool walling effect. For water and 2 colorless, you do 160 damage, which is it's not great, but you got to wall off against any Pokemon that are attacking that have an ability on them. And there are so many attacking Pokemon that also have abilities, like an Arceus V-Star, like a Chen Pao. So many attackers in the game just could not hit Vulpix if Vulpix gets set up. And we saw this used to great effect at EUIC 2023, where Alex Schmansky's Arceus Duraludon deck had a Vulpix teched into it and was able to win the tournament. We saw it at Champions League 2024, where Arceus Vulpix won the whole thing, again, just walling things off. And then at Brisbane, we saw a Frostmoth Inteleon deck that also had Vulpix in there to play like one of the weird, funkier winning decks that you will ever see, that had Frostmoth's accelerating energy to a bunch of different attackers, with Vulpix being one of them. I don't think Regieleki VMAX ever truly lived up to its potential, but I'm not sure it really had the potential. Like, it's a 3-prize Pokemon with an okay attack. Max Thunder and Lightning did 220 damage. Its ability's nice, being able to boost damage by 30 on basic Lightning Pokemon. And for a time, players thought that Regieleki plus Miraidon was the way to go. That's why we had Miraidon with Regieleki as the League battle deck. But over time, players figured out that Miraidon was just better without Regieleki, at which point we just didn't really see Regieleki see much play. There were a couple of Arceus decks that would play Regieleki as a way, like I should note in particular, Regieleki V's Lightning Wall attack was kind of cool, where you did 100 damage and you took 100 less damage on the following turn. So this could be a surprisingly tanky Pokemon here and there. And it did see some success to its credit. Champions League Miyagi, the Miraidon Regieleki deck won, and that's probably the only major win for Miraidon with Regieleki. And then it also saw a top 8 at EUIC when the deck was still new, and 5th at EUIC, again, when Miraidon Regieleki was a hot new deck, and players were still trying to figure things out, and this seemed like the most logical partner for it at the time. But once players figured out, like, Path to the Peak, Flaffy, Raichu, Raikou as well, then Regieleki just kind of fell off the face of the earth. Forest Sealstone is one of the best cards in the Sword and Shield era. If you were playing a Pokemon V without a V-Star power, you'd have this card in your deck so that you could just grab any card that you wanted from the deck. We saw this win Worlds in 2023 in Vance Kelly's Mew VMAX deck. We also saw it win in 2023 at Charlotte Regionals with Eternatus Wheezing. And yeah, shout outs to Eternatus VMAX. That was unfortunately a card that it rotated earlier, but it didn't see a lot of tournament play because we were in the pandemic, and Eternatus was one of the big archetypes that unfortunately got hurt by the pandemic, just closing down a lot of tournaments. But just before it rotated out, it finally got its big regional win here with Forest Seal Stone in tow. And then at NAIC, Urshifu Inteleon was able to get the win with Forest Seal Stone in the deck as well. I will admit, I don't like Capturing Aroma as a card, and I actually kind of despise the fact that this card even saw play, because Capturing Aroma came out at a time when Pokemon Search was amazing. We had Quick Ball for basic Pokemon that you put into your hand and not directly on the bench, so it made it easier to use cards like Luminion. We had Evolution Incense, which is just an item that let you get an evolution Pokemon. We had Level Ball to get smaller Pokemon from our deck and put it into our hand. And Capturing Aroma was just not as good as any of those cards. We had Ultra Ball, which is better than Capturing Aroma, but a lot of those cards from the Sword and Shield era for Pokemon Search rotated out, and certain decks that were not serviced enough by Nest Balls and Ultra Balls then use Capturing Aroma as sort of a desperation way of getting more Pokemon into their hand. And I just don't I'm spoiled. I like decks that don't need this card and the coin flip and the unreliability of Capturing Aroma. But because Pokemon Search was not as good in the Scarlet and Violet era, this card did see play. And as you can see, it's got wins. I think Lugia is the big deck that would use Capturing Aroma, just giving you more opportunities to potentially get your Lugia and Archeops pieces ready to go, but also saw a win at the World Championships in 2023 in an Arceus Regidrago deck. Emergency Jelly is a very weird card. If your Pokemon had 30 HP or less, you could heal 120 damage from it, and this pretty much had very few uses, but it did see some play in this legendary Tim Franklin Frostmoth box deck. You could use this to heal stuff like an Articuno that was getting damaged when you're paralyzing. Palkia Inteleon, I think, was also for the Articuno when you were paralyzing stuff with that attack. And I think where it's most popular is in Roaring Moon, the early days of Roaring Moon, when you would do your Frenzied Gouging and you'd have the Emergency Jelly on, you'd heal, and then you give yourself an extra 128. You get 120 HP back so that your Roaring Moon could maybe tank a hit before actually going down. But pretty much once Roaring Moon rotated out, once Roaring Moon kind of moved away from this as a strategy, Emergency Jelly just fell by the wayside. Serena was a card that wasn't made to last. Yes, it has 2 effects, and you can pick one of them, and one of them was consistently good. Letting you discard up to 3 cards and then drawing up to 5 gives you a draw option, while also having a discard option for any deck that needed that discard synergy. But being able to gust a Pokemon V into the active was amazing, and there were decks that were running Serena, some combination of Serena and Boss, so you had the flexibility of having a draw card plus a gusting card. But because it was specifically tied to Pokemon V, even at the time this was released, you couldn't gust up non-Pokemon V. So any sort of non-V Pokemon you couldn't gust up, making it a little worse. And then as Pokemon EX came into the format, this card just got worse and worse, so we didn't really see it get played much after the Silver Tempest era, but still saw some big wins here. For example, we saw it win LAIC in Towards Lugia list, we saw it in Piper Lapine's Mewtwo control list, and even in a Flaffy box deck in 2023, winning the whole thing with Serena in there. And yeah, Serena giving you the opportunity to discard Lightning Energy that Flaffy could reattach later. Worker was not the best card, but in certain situations and certain decks really liked having it. Goldengo was one of the big ones off the top of my head, even though I don't have... Oh yeah, I do have Goldengo here. It was one of the decks that wanted that, where you could build your hand and keep your resources. But the big thing was Worker could knock off Path to the Peak, which was this card's biggest op. And a lot of decks were running Worker as a way of getting Path to the Peak out of play while also drawing more cards. Gardevoir was one of the biggest benefactors of this deck, because Path to the Peak in the early days of Gardevoir would really shut Gardevoir down, and Worker could help you just knock that out of the way, while also drawing more cards. In the early days of Charizard, where we were still trying to figure out how to play Charizard, Worker was in there to get Path to the Peak out of play because that also wreaked havoc on our deck. And then, yeah, Goldengo was a big one for a while where you could use this to knock off Path to the Peak. But once Path to the Peak rotated out, Worker did not see, it wasn't necessary anymore. Misfortune Sisters was an amazing card for control decks, letting those players look at the top 5 cards of your opponent's deck and then discarding item cards. In particular, in Snorlax decks, you could use that to find those switch cards and throw them in the garbage so that your opponent could not get their Trap Luminion out of the active, and then you could just win by deck out that way. Misfortune Sisters is a very frustrating card, but yeah, quintessential piece of the control deck archetype, which is why we see a number of first place finishes. Actually, all of these are control decks, even the Piper Lupine Mewtwo control deck, which was less about attacking and more just about healing forever with that Mewtwo. Leafy Camo Poncho was another card that kind of didn't have a long lifespan because it was tied to Pokemon V just before Pokemon EX came out. It did prevent effects of supporter cards being done to bench Pokemon, so things like, actually it was active Pokemon here as well, it doesn't state it, but the biggest one here is that any Pokemon V or VMAX with Leafy Camo Poncho on, you could not gust into the active with Boss's Orders, which is the big use for it. And it did see a little bit of play here and there. Top 8 finish at EUIC in an Arceus Flying Pikachu deck, making sure your Flying Pikachu doesn't get gusted up too early. Mew VMAX, we saw this in with Grant Hayes' Mew deck, and then 29th at Dortmund Regionals. This was a weird one. Like, top 32 is not necessarily the biggest achievement, but it was a Lost Zone Dialga deck, and this was just before the Matang showed up, and it was a really wacky deck list that surprised everybody with how well it did, showing Dialga having some signs of life after not really doing anything for a very long time. Radiant Serena had the helpful ability of healing 20 damage from all of your Pokemon. There were times where you could just survive just that little bit longer and stay below one of those key breakpoints because of that extra 20 healing. And now its time in Lugia decks wasn't particularly long, but because it was being played at a time when Lugia was very strong, it saw a lot of success during that stretch, including wins at Regional League Surabaya, as well as the World Championships in 2023 in the Seniors Division, and then at Fresno Regionals, also getting a win there with Lugia. Articuno is a nifty card from Silver Tempest with that Wild Freeze attack where you do 70 damage and you do 50 damage to yourself, but your opponent's active Pokemon is now paralyzed. You could combo this with Emergency Jelly and heal off that damage after a couple of turns and ultimately uptrade against multi-price Pokemon, or you could use this to get in some incremental damage and stall for time while a bigger attacker is getting set up. And it did see some success in tournament play. We saw it in a Frostmoth and Teleon deck that we keep coming back to at Brisbane Regionals that one time. But besides that one deck that we see over and over again, it did see a 3rd place finish in a Gudra deck, as well as most recently a 5th at Champions League Tokyo 2024 in a Palkia Noctowl deck. So this wasn't that long ago with the Terapagos and having that Articuno as a tech attacker. Radiant Alakazam is a ton of fun and facilitated some really awesome combos. That Painful Spoons ability letting you move up to 2 damage counters from one of your opponent's Pokemon to another one of their Pokemon led to some really insane combos, whether it was Ryuki Okada's Dragapult Dusknoir deck or Cyrus Davis with Urshifu and Teleon. Even Arceus Duraludon Umbreon, where it doesn't, that's a deck that didn't really have any sort of bench sniping to it, still made great use of that Radiant Alakazam ability to win. Yeah, this card has done pretty well for itself. Again, not at the same tier as a Greninja or a Charizard in terms of Radiant Pokemon, but this did see a fair bit of success, and its attack Mind Ruler is actually not that bad either. For any deck that can cover that Psychic and Colorless cost, doing 20 damage for each card in your opponent's hand did make it a not so bad attacker in very specific situations if you had the energy for it. By virtue of being tied to Pokemon V, V-Guard Energy did not have the longest shelf life, where as Pokemon EX came out, Vs just weren't as relevant, and then just V-Guard Energy being a colorless energy made it not as useful for many different decks. But yeah, this saw a ton of play in Lugia decks in particular, and even saw some play in Arceus decks as well. Shoutouts to Kashvinder Singh Man, who is a notable pro player who I see on Twitter all the time, and we've covered their decks a couple of times on this channel as well, getting a first place win at Singapore Regionals 2023 with their Arceus Giratina deck that had that V-Guard energy on there. And I think one of the big ones is that in the sort of that Giratina mirror interaction where they could both one-hit KO each other, if you've got the V-Guard energy as one of those energies on that Giratina is not going to get one-shotted in return. So there are some cool interactions that V-Guard energy would facilitate by being in play. And yeah, because of its colorless nature and V-Guard, like V Pokemon, this pretty much just became a Lugia colorless energy fodder to fill out your energy pool for Archeops to distribute to the world. We're nearing the end of this video, and we are at Crown Zenith, which is a specialty set with a lot of reprints and new art, but there are a couple of new cards to the set, and we're going to cover a couple of promo cards here as well. Bidoof was a big one. This became the go-to Bidoof because of that carefree countenance ability, preventing it from getting damaged while it is on the bench. And that became the best way to play it. Also single retreat. So this became the Bidoof to play once this came out. And you can see like this had a ton of success first at EUIC and Charizard in the limited amount of time when Charizard was also running Bibarel. This was a staple in Chen Pao decks, being able to draw cards and help you build out your combos that way. And then Arceus Giratina in 2023, Landon Kettler won the whole thing with this Bidoof in there. Zamazenta was a really cool card. It was a little tankier than it looks because of that Metal Shield ability helping it take 30 less damage from attacks, but the real selling point here is Retaliate, where for 2 metal and a colorless does 100 damage, and if a Pokemon was knocked out, one of your Pokemon was knocked out on a previous turn, you do 120 more damage. At that point, you're swinging for 220 with a single prizer, and you can take out basic Vs and a lot of the supporting V and EX Pokemon as well with a single prizer. Fantastic. And this mostly saw play in Lost Box decks where you could cover this cost with Mirage Gate. Saw a first at Indonesia Regional League with a Lost Box deck, but we did see it in Gudra as well, where Zamazenta could cover, Lost Box again, Mirage Gate could cover that cost. And even in the Dialga Matang decks, when those were still a thing, Zamazenta was in there as a capable single prize attacker, winning first place at Indiana Regionals. Zeraora VMAX and V-Star were cool cards that never really saw much play. I did cover these every time I found something that was cool and notable. I thought that, Zeraora VMAX had a cool attack and reactive pulse, doing 60 damage for each of your opponent's Pokemon in play that had an ability, and in certain decks, you were one-hit KOing everything in there, which was awesome. Max Fist for 240 and having to discard 2 energy was not ideal, but could be a solid end game attack, or at least a way of where you didn't get burned too much by having to discard 2 energy. And then Zeraora V-Star being able to do a 190 and discard a stadium was not the best, but that Lightning Storm Star is a very cool snipe attack that was incredibly powerful, if expensive. And we are talking about it here, one, because I really like these cards, even if they never fully were good enough to compete consistently, but because it got top 8 at Champions League 2023, where it was an Arceus deck that had both of these Zeraoras teched in. Because they both evolved from the same Zeraora V, you could go with the VMAX or the V-Star as you saw fit. So really cool that these cards were at least able to shine in one particular moment. Regigigas V-Star is a card that saw a little bit of play when it launched. It was paired with Arceus V-Star, and it gave Arceus a bulky attacker, 230 damage and can attack on the next turn. Is okay. You were knocking out some of the bigger threats like a Roaring Moon and Iron Hands. 300 HP on a stage 1 Pokemon was very strong as well. The V-Star power wasn't really used at all, but you were using this just as a bulky attacker here and there, and it did see some top 8 finishes in major tournaments as well as a top 32 at Melbourne Regionals. This is a card that kind of had its livelihood entirely depended on Arceus, and once Arceus kind of got phased, like power crept out of the format, so did Regigigas. Lucario V-Star is a card that I have a soft spot in my heart for. Now, the Lucario V is actually not good. There's one that rotated earlier that was a better Lucario V, but Lucario V-Star definitely had a time and place where it was good. Its fighting knuckle attack for a fighting and a colorless did 120 damage, and if your opponent's active Pokemon is a Pokemon V, this attack does 120 more damage. So in the context of Arceus decks, doing 240 damage was enough to take out a lot of basic Vs and basic EXs, and you could even power this up with a fighting and a double turbo energy and still be swinging for 220 damage. So really good numbers there. And then its Aura Star attack for a fighting and a colorless does 70 damage for each energy attached to all of your opponent's Pokemon. So if your opponent got really greedy, especially in an era where Arceus V-Star was big and there was just a lot of energy and play on both sides, this could one-hit KO anything in the game. And I vividly remember playing like an Arceus Lucario Hoopa V deck was like one of my all-time favorite decks. And I think this Joinville one that won was of that style as well. Shoutouts to Pedro Petrucci for the big win at Joinville Regionals in 2022, but it also saw a top 8 finish at Curitiba in 2023 and 7th at the World Championships in the Seniors Division, where it was in an Arceus Flying Pikachu deck. And I didn't even realize it got top 8 in Seniors Division until I was doing the research for that. So I'm glad to see Lucario get at least a little bit of shine here. Now, of course, because the damage is tied to Pokemon V, and as EXs became a thing, this card pretty much fell off fairly quickly, but I'm glad to see that Lucario did have a little bit of success here and there. Zacian V from Sword and Shield base set is a legendary card that saw a ton of play. And unfortunately, that had rotated out by the time Zacian V-Star was here. The Zacian V we had in his place was not very good. And this card didn't see a lot of play, admittedly. 200 Shred on Break Edge was good, but not good enough. You weren't one-hit KOing a lot of the big basic meta-relevant attackers at the time. 310 on that Sword Star V-Star power was good, and you were knocking out all the V-Stars, and in certain cases you might even be able to knock out a V-Max, but the damage to yourself wasn't great either. It did see some success here and there, like for a brief moment in time. In particular, the reason why I highlighted this card here is I'd made a Zacian V-Star. I had the idea for a Lost Box Zacian V-Star deck, and then not long after I put out this video, Joko Wong got second at Perth Regionals with a very similar deck. And not to say that they copied my video. They were probably working on their own concept at the time, and there was some differences between our two builds. But just to kind of see Zacian V-Star proof of concept in that format could do some damage, and it was very cool to see it get second place. And then from there, it got top 32 at Bochum Regionals, and then 44th at Vancouver. Kyogre's a weird card. This is one that people were using for its dynamic wave attack for 3 water and a colorless. You put 3 of the energy back into your hand, and then you get 180 snipe. I mostly saw this in Japanese deck lists in Chen Pao decks, where, yes, it totally makes sense in the context of Chen Pao having a snipe attack, but outside of Japan, this card didn't really see a lot of play. It's one of the weird regional differences between Japan and the rest of the world, where Japan really liked this card, and internationally, this didn't see as much play. Regardless, it did see some success in international tournaments, second in Special Event Lima in 2024 in a Chen Pao deck. All of these are Chen Pao. Third at Special Event Cape Town. I should have wrote down the year. And then at EUIC 2024, got top 32. Whew! That was a lot, and you probably noticed that there's a bit of an outfit change here. It took so long to record that I had to record the back half of this video at a different time. But that was a really cool stroll down memory lane, and I did cover a lot of the big cards in my previous video where I did the top 20 cards, but I really enjoyed the process of going through all of the sets and recalling the history of these cards, and pretty much anything that had some sort of tournament success. I'm glad to be able to talk about those cards and share their successes with you before they go away later this year. But for now, I'm going to go take a rest. This has been quite the process to record. It's going to take eons to edit, but I think it's worth it here to be able to give these cards their flowers before they ride off into the expanded sunset. But for now, I gotta get going. Thank you so much for watching. You can find me on all the things: YouTube, TikTok, Twitter, and Instagram at InThirdPerson. You can find me on Twitch at InThirdPerson, where I stream the Pokemon trading card game every Sunday at 10 a.m. Eastern Time. And check out the website, inthirdperson.com, for more articles and videos on video games, board games, and other nerdy pursuits. So until the next one, I'll see you later. Bye-bye.